Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you for joining us for the Power BI Dev Camp session in March 2022, Scaling Multi-Tenant Solutions Using Service Principal Profiles. With us, as always, is Ted Pattison, our Principal Program Manager from the Power BI Customer Advisory Team and your Dev Camp counselor for today. Good morning, Ted. How's it going?
It's going great. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what the session is today?
Well, today's session is, let me just read the slide, Scaling Multi-Tenant Solutions Using Service Principal Profiles. So it's a brand new topic. We just went from private preview to GA with Service Principal Profiles last week. So I'm glad I have a 60-minute session to kind of really drill into the details. Couple pieces of housekeeping. Always, if you're looking for details, Power BI Dev Camp, has session information and different links. For instance, today we're going to be looking at a developer sample. There's the link. Also, there's some documentation and there's PowerPoint slides. So if you want any of those, you're going to be able to get those here. Plus information on old sessions. Such as you find a session here that you're interested in. Note that you're going to be able to go there, get the resources, and watch the recording. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back to the slides here. The next thing I want to point out is that there is a main code sample, that this whole session is built on. And there is a GitHub repository. So once again, let me go back here. And if you go to GitHub Power BI Dev Camp, that is where I host all my different repositories. And this one I pinned as the number one. If we go take a look at that, here's the application. And as you go down there, you'll also see there's a table of contents. In about 30 pages, worth of content right here. One other point is that you could read this online, as a GitHub README file, or there's also a Word document or PDF file, so if you were to, click on that PDF file, you'd be able to kind of download it and, get the same experience to kind of, look at that offline. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of point out the different resources that we have, and you'll be seeing this app soon enough. Okay, now let's go ahead and move ahead. So the first thing I want to do is introduce service principal profiles. They're a brand new feature that we've added on the Power BI embedding team, and they're specifically for developers that are using app-only embedding and using Power BI, as a platform as a service, more than a software as a service approach. Now, let's also kind of talk about creating a multi-tenant application. And when I say multi-tenant, we're going to have lots of different customers, and we'd like to have reporting, for each of these customers, but we don't want to intermingle assets and data from two different customers together. So we really need this kind of idea of a customer tenant, or a place in Power BI where I want to put and isolate things for one of my customers. So once again, the idea of a tenant, is conceptual. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create this tenant with a single Power BI workspace. Every time we get a new customer, we're going to create a new workspace, and then I'll upload a PBIX file, and that will create my report and my data set. If it's import mode, the report will work. If it's direct query, it won't work till you set data source credentials, but we've got to set those data source credentials with code. And once you've done that, you're going to be able to connect to an import mode database and refresh, or you can connect, directly to a direct query, and then we'll basically have a customer. But there's a lot of steps there. So what we really want to be able to do is write this batch of code that just can punch out, creating the second tenant, the third, the fourth, the fifth, however many customer tenants that you need, your application is going to be, basically managing these conceptual tenants, which generally is going to be a Power BI workspace, and the assets inside. Now, in most cases, your tenant will just be one Power BI workspace. There's one little caveat, and that is a workspace maxes out at 1,000 artifacts. You could have 200 data sets and then 800 reports, and then you hit 1,000. So you could conceptually go to multiple workspaces, for a single tenant. But we're going to keep it simple and just have one workspace per tenant. Now, what's the sequence of code that we write? And generally, it's calling the Power BI REST API to create a workspace. If you have A SKUs or P SKUs, you basically make a call to assign that workspace with a premium capacity. You're going to import PBIX files. quite often when we create PBIX data set projects, we templatize the data set parameters for things like database server and connection string. So you might update data set parameters, to point your kind of template data set to now a specific database for this customer. Now you're going to set data source credentials, and you're going to start a refresh operation. So this is the kind of code we typically write, in multi-tenant applications. And what the Power BI team will tell you is it's best to do this as a service principal instead of as a master user account. Several years back, we only supported master user accounts, so you had to use those. But once we enabled, service principals to be able to call the REST API, it's much better. It avoids problems with multi-factor authentication. You don't have a strict, user password rotation. And also just using a service principal to talk to Power BI, once again is embracing Power BI, with a PaaS mindset, platform as a service, not so much a SaaS, software as a service mindset. The way I look at it is you're using Power BI, as platform as a service, but customers are using what you're building as software as a service. Now, one of the big reasons that many people are interested in this topic is we have this important limitation of 1,000 workspaces. And the idea is that no user or service principal can be in a member of more than 1,000 workspaces, or you are in unsupported territory. Now, the purpose of this limitation is to maintain high levels of performance. Now, what we find is that performance suffers, as a service principal is added to 1, 2, 10, 100, 500 workspaces. So what we have is this 1,000 workspace limitation, mainly to enforce that code doesn't slow down beyond a degree where, we feel it's reasonable. Now, when you think about it, let's make some observations about the 1,000 workspace limitation. Okay, so a scenario where a service principal has more than 1,000 workspaces is unsupported. But you can't say service principal 1, 999 workspaces is good. Service principal 2 has 1,001 bad. It's not that black and white. 1,000 gets you into unsupported territory, but performance is going to slow down as the number of workspaces that your service principal as a member of increases. And you can think of it this way. Behind the scenes, Power BI mains metadata. Think of access control lists. And so they build these, and it includes all the GUIDs of the service principals, or of the workspaces this service principal can access. So it's one of those things where if you have to determine if a GUID is in a list, and I give you one list that has one GUID and another list that has 1,000 GUIDs, which one's quicker to find? So what you'll find is that if you have a service principal that's in 100 workspaces, it's going to perform better with REST API calls, than one that's in 1,000. If it's in 10 workspaces, even better. You see where we're going? What's the optimal number of workspaces, your service principal should be a member of? And it's 1. Okay. And this is something where when you're kind of thinking of coding in the small, maybe you'll have 20 customer tenants and 500 users. This probably isn't something you have to worry too much about. But as things get, bigger and bigger, and you start talking about pushing through the 1,000 workspace barrier and having, tens of thousands of users, it really does make a difference in scalability. Now, next thing we have to talk about is data source credentials. So let's talk about data sets. What we want is data sets hold data, and we need to isolate the data in a customer tenant from other customer tenants. I mean, the last thing you want is to create an application, where a user in tenant A sees data from tenant B belonging to a different customer. So what are the rules? Each data set is owned by one specific user or service principal. If you look at the configured by setting, you can see that. Now, the data set owner must set data source credentials. If user 1 owns a data set, user 2 can't set the data source credentials. The data set owner has to be the one that sets them. Now, also, data source credentials are scoped, by the user or service principal, but not by the workspace. So, for a service principal, you'll have data sources which have a scope that extend all the way across the tenant. So it's possible to share data source, data set credentials across workspaces. It's not what we'd like to do, and it can really bite you if you don't know what's going on. Okay, so once again, we have to kind of think about data source credential isolation as part of what we're doing. Now, there are going to be three different strategies we want to look at. Yes, I want to get to service principal profiles, but I want to take a quick 3 or 4 minute tour, through what we did before we had service principal profiles. Now, the first thing we did is we had single service principal. So the obvious downside is you can only go up to 1,000 workspaces. But also, as you go from 1 to 1,000 workspaces, you're also going to slow down gradually. Maybe not a big deal if you don't have that many users, but when you're thinking scalability, certainly, having your service principal a member of hundreds of workspaces, you have to look at it. That's not an optimal code path. Okay. Also, the service principal is the owner of every data source credential across all customer tenants. So we're going to give this very poor marks, when it comes to data source credential isolation. Now, one good aspect is it just requires one time you go to Azure AD, create an application, and then we can kind of look at that as a one and done activity. Now, this was the most popular for our larger Power BI embedded customers, using service principal pooling. So it can scale to, any number of required tenants, give or take. But the idea is it gets less performant because you're still going to have service principals, that might have hundreds of workspaces. Now, when it comes to data source credential isolation, it's a little better, but it doesn't solve the problem, as you might have one service principal, that is the owner of data source credentials, across hundreds of customer tenants. Some of those customers could be competitors. Now, it requires an occasional need to create a new Azure AD application. As every time we need to increase the pool size, we have to go back through IT and get the Azure, Active Directory team to create another application for me. Now, the last solution, in theory, is the very best, and that's one service principal per customer tenant. Now, you can scale pretty much as high as Azure AD will allow you in creating service principals. So let's say that's about 5,000. It gives you the best performance because the service principal is now only going to be a member of a single workspace, and you have no worries about data source isolation, because we isolate data source credentials, by the service principal. So you never have, one service principal that's the owner, across customer tenant boundaries. Now, what's the reason this doesn't work? Is we have to continually create more Azure AD applications. And we find the larger the organization, the more that's going to be absolutely impossible. With all kinds of approval processes and other bureaucratic red tape, trying to convince the IT shop that you have an application that's just going to create Azure AD applications on demand, just is something that didn't sell. Okay, so now if we rank these three, single service principal, low overhead, only one Azure AD application, but pretty bad with isolation and, not great with performance. Service principal pooling, a little bit more Azure AD overhead, maybe once every couple of weeks, you have to create a new Azure AD application. But once again, if we look at data source isolation and performance, they're just okay. And we get to service principal, per tenant, very high overhead, so high it might be impossible. But when we look at the data source isolation and performance, those, come up very high. So now we can introduce the entree for tonight. Service principal profiles. So the idea of a service principal profile is that your service principal can create local accounts whenever it needs to, right in the Power BI service. So there's a new profiles API, and it allows the service principal to create service principal profiles. And the Power BI embedding team, has kind of engineered this to scale into the hundreds of thousands. So there's really no limit on how many service principal profiles, can be created. Now, one thing that's interesting is the service principal profiles are just recognized within the Power BI subsystem, for authorization. Service principal profiles are completely unknown to Azure AD. Now, the way it works is a service principal will create its own profiles, and there will always be a parent-child relationship between the parent service principal and all the profiles that it creates. So profiles can never be created standalone. Also, the service principal profile is the only one that can see and use the service principal profiles it creates. So you can't create a profile in Service Principal 1 and switch it over to Service Principal 2. They each create them independently, and there's not going to be anything through the Power BI service UI that ever tells you a Service Principal profile is there. There's no particular lists. Now, the way that we're going to work this is that our application just needs a single service principal, but it's going to be creating service principal profiles. And the service principal profile is now recognized as what I would call a first-class security principal by Power BI, not by Azure AD. Azure AD doesn't know anything about the profile. But the idea is that in Power BI, a service principal profile can be added as a workspace member. Now, also, a service principal can execute Power BI REST API calls under the identity of itself or as one of its children, one of its profiles. Now, what we can do is we can execute code as a service principal profile and run the exact same code we've been doing to create a workspace, associate it with a capacity, import PBX files, configure data sets, set data source credentials. But now we'll do it as a profile, as opposed to the parent context, which is the service principal itself. Okay. Now, we're going to use profiles whenever we build out a customer tenant by creating the workspace and populating it with contents. But then we also have to use the exact same profile on the consumption side. So as you want to query a workspace and see how many reports are in there, or you want to create an embed token, so you can implement Apple's data embedding. Once again, you're going to be making these calls as the profile identity, not as the service principal parent or root identity. Now, what we're going to have is an application design or a best practice, which says we should create a new service principal profile, for each customer tenant. Doesn't cost you anything. And the idea is you create a profile, and then you start executing code as that profile. Now, what's nice is that this can scale, over 100,000. Each service principal owns its own data source credentials. So there's no ownership that goes across customer tenant boundaries. We have optimized performance because the service principal profile is a member of exactly one workspace. And from, the overhead of AD, just like single service principal, we basically have a one and done attitude of creating the Azure AD application, and that's all we need. Once we go into production, there's no need to keep creating new Azure AD applications. Now, if we kind of add on service principal profiles, to the chart we saw before, we see they have a low overhead because you only need one Azure AD application, yet they kind of give us the same, high performance and complete isolation that we get from service principal per tenant. But now we can just do it, without having to continually create new Azure AD applications. Now, let's keep going through here. And I see some questions there. Let me get one more section, then I'll kind of address the questions that are there. Now, when we want to use profiles, we have to turn on a developer setting. So if I go back here, let's go back up to Power BI. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to developer settings. And once I get to developer settings, here's the setting that's been around for a while that you're probably familiar with, allows service principal to use Power BI APIs. But now there's a second one that just showed up, in your tenant last week, which allows service principals to create and use profiles. Okay. And basically I have an Azure AD app that is in an Azure security group. And that security group, is configured, in both these places right here. One other little gotcha is if I go to the very top here and workspace creation, you have to make sure that either the entire organization or the service principal is in this group. And the idea is generally we want our service principal, and more importantly, our service principal profiles, to be able to create new workspaces. So, that's a setting. And if you read the documentation, it steps you through setting up these pieces. Now, here's the Profiles API. A profile is just a GUID with a name on it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create profiles with the create profile call. We can delete profiles. Now, if we kind of look at, just the raw HTTP request attributes, if I want to create a profile, I do a post. And, as I do that post, I have to kind of send in the display name. Now, maybe we'll go over here and, let's go ahead and start up this sample application. Note we have our good friend Fiddler here. Always got to have Fiddler. And so what I want to do here, is let's go to profiles. And, what we can do right here, is we can say, add a profile. Let's say we add a profile. In this one, we're going to name Bob right here. So I've created the profile. Notice that in this application, these first two, tenants link and profiles link, read from the database. But if you click on Power BI profiles, it's going to go back and, it's going to, basically do a query. But here you can kind of see here's profiles. And if we kind of look at the, here's the JSON going in, here's the JSON going out. So the idea is here's the name, you create the profile, you get the ID back. Note that this display name, has to be unique across all the profiles for one service principal. You can duplicate across service principals, but generally that would be across applications. And then the last thing we have here, I left one thing in tenants. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I should have cleaned up a bit more. And now back here, we have one more profile. I want to go ahead and delete that profile. And you can see that, deleting the profile, you have an HTTP delete. You need to have the GUID, of that profile. Okay. Now, one of the observations, is that, as you're creating profiles, you can do it with a raw request, but you get the ID back in the response. And generally, you'll find that you need to track your profiles in a database so that you have the display name and the ID. Now, if you're using the Power BI .NET SDK, you can see that it's a lot easier. We have a new type that we introduced, service principal profile. And we also have a profiles object, PBI client.profiles.create profile. And after that call goes across the network and returns, I can say profile.id, and now I have both the name and the ID. Likewise, when you want to delete a profile, you're going to have that GUID, another good reason to keep them in the database. Now, if you want to get profiles, you basically just hit the endpoint. And remember that you'll have an access token for a specific service principal. So you'll only see the profiles, from that service principal. Arguably, if you have a service principal and you create 10 profiles, and then someone goes to Azure AD, and deletes the Azure AD application, the service principal gets deleted, and now those profiles are orphaned, and the Power BI, runtime will clean those up over time. But one of the important things is, don't delete the Azure AD application, because it could have, a big effect on things if you're working with profiles. Now, let's say you've created a profile. Now, when I say you, imagine you're a service principal. So you're a service principal and you're running. And so you have to create a new tenant. And so what you're going to do is you're going to create a service principal, and then you're going to kind of do this kung fu move where you start running your code as the service principal, not as the parent, down below. But let's say that you create a profile and then you start running code with that profile's identity and you want to talk to a workspace. Well, that profile has to be added, as a workspace member. So what you can see here, on this slide, is that we have, something down here, inside the add user, that we hadn't had before. If you kind of look at these first three things, if I use this, and I kind of just ignore the profile stuff down here, that would add the service principal as a member. But if you now add the profile in the ID section, now we'll see the identity of the profile. And once again, if you're using the SDK, go to create a new group user. I want this profile to be an admin, principal type app. You need the service principal ID. And, maybe a quick tangent here. Let's say that I go back here. And so now, let's go back to our application. And you have this application, and I'm going to click right here. And, here's the application ID. That's not what you use when you want to identify the service principal so you can add it, into an access control list, into membership for a workspace. So you need the service principal object ID. And the way to get that, and this is kind of a little known secret, but over here you have managed application and local directory. And it's tricky because they cut it off so you can't see what it is. But if you click on this link, and then finally you get to this properties page, this is the service principal object ID. So if you ever need to add a service principal, or one of its profiles to a list, you will need that ID. You can also get it with any of the, Azure AD APIs or PowerShell commandlet libraries. Okay. Over here, let's kind of look down, and you can see that, if I have added a user, the user shows up like this. If I add the service principal, the parent, not one of the child profiles, I'll see the name of the application and it will say service principal. And when we have a profile, it's going to show up with just the display name and then service principal profile. Okay, all this looks good. Now, let's start working with calling into the Power BI REST API as a service principal profile. And there's only one trick. You could say it's kind of tricky to get started, but the idea is that you will add a new header, which is the x-Power BI-profile-ID. And once you've added that in, and you also need to have the access token, just like you would in a service principal call, you have the authorization header, bearer space, and then the service principal access token. And if you leave the Power BI profile ID header out, it executes as the parent service principal. If you put the Power BI profile ID header in, then it executes under the identity of the profile, not the parent service principal. Okay, what could be as simple as that? Now, here's the question is, how do you get this Power BI profile ID header value into your request that you send to the Power BI REST API? And so here's one technique. This technique is very explicit, and that is, first of all, we'll create a Power BI client object as normal, and then I'll just go to the Power BI client, HTTP client, and I can say default request headers, and there's that. And once again, I need the profile. So in the application that I'm going to be demoing in just a second, we're able to keep all the profiles, in an underlying database so we can find the profile ID whenever we need to set that special header, with the profile ID. But the idea, one more time, coming back here is, let's say that we set, the header, then we just go back to calling the Power BI REST API as normal, but our calls are now executing, under the identity of the profile, not the parent service principal. Okay, now there's one other thing that you could do. Now, so let's say that I have two, different methods right here. This one, get Power BI client, just does it the old-fashioned way. Just give me back a Power BI client object that I can execute under the identity of my parent service principal. Well, now we have a second one, which is get Power BI client for profile. And I pass the profile ID. And what you're going to see right here is that the Power BI client constructor, takes a profile ID GUID as a third parameter. Now, back here, inside of our application, one of the things, that we're going to be doing, is we're going to sometimes be running code, as the parent service principal, but sometimes we want to run it as a profile. Now, let's say that, up here we have this Power BI client. Now, back here, what you can see is that you have this class level instance variable, Power BI client, PBI client. And then we're going to create this method called set calling context. And the idea is that if someone calls set calling context with no parameters, we'll just basically get the PBI client for the parent service principal. But if someone passes a profile ID, we'll basically pass back a Power BI client object, that will execute under the identity of that service principal profile. So now you've seen that, the question is, well, when do I execute code as the parent service principal versus when do I execute code as a service principal profile? And it turns out it's pretty easy. The parent service principal, you execute with that whenever you want to create or manage your profiles. But anytime it comes, to creating a workspace populated with content or accessing that content, that's always done, with a service principal profile. So for instance, if we look over here, I have a create profile. So at the very top, we'll call set calling context to make sure that call goes, against the Power BI service as the parent service principal. Same thing with delete profile or get profile. Okay, but now let's say it's time to onboard a new client. So the idea is you will create a principal. Once you've created the principal, you've got the ID. So you can call set calling context and now start making calls under the identity of that profile. And what kind of code do we have here? Same kind of code you're probably used to. Create a workspace, upload a PBX file, assign to capacity. Okay, now, finally here, we have generating embed tokens. So if you use a profile, to build the workspace and its content, you then have the profile as a member of that workspace, but not the root or the parent service principal itself. And it turns out that the service principal doesn't really have to do anything but manage profiles. Profiles are doing all the work of creating content. And then if you create a customer tenant with profile 123, you got to go and find, profile 123 or its ID to be able to access content in there. Because generally you might have it so that the profile, is the only member of the site. And here's just an example of generating an embed token and seeing that inside there. Okay, so I think we can do a little bit more demoing now and kind of see how, all this works together. So let's go ahead and, inside of this application, let's say we want to start, by, creating a couple new tenants. So inside this application, we'll say onboard new tenant, so we'll create one, which is for wingtip. And so the logic here is to create a new profile and then start executing code, as that particular profile. So, once this runs, here you can see that we make a call to profiles. If I look in the headers, there's no special header there because it's the service principal. But now that we've created this, and you can kind of see that we have this ID of EC32, let's look at this call to create a workspace, and there's the profile ID. So we just have a series of calls, that all have this inside there, and at the end of the day, what do we really have? So let's go back, and I'm now going to go over to Power BI, and inside of Power BI, let's go to this workspace. And if I go to the workspace and I go to access, what you can see here is that in my demo app, I have this idea of the admin user. So every time we create a workspace, I add my own account so I can demo and get here. But you can see that the service principal profile, is the one that is given access inside here. Okay. Now let's go back here. Let's create a second tenant. This one is going to be Contoso, and we'll switch the database, for that. We'll go ahead, we'll choose OK, and, once again, we go through this same set of steps, of creating a new profile. Once we've created the profile, let's then, it's kind of like for you old timers that used to drive stick shifts, you basically create the profile and then you go into neutral and you put it into gear, and what's going to be that gear, that's going to be starting to execute, code, as the profile that you've just created to go inside there. Okay, so what we've just kind of seen is the building side, the construction side. How about the consumption side? Let me go back here and let's remove everything. And so let's say that now I'm interested in, going back and kind of getting a view of, what's inside that profile. So here you can see that, the application is able to, query who are the members, what are the data sets and reports. And, what you can see is your application needs to say, oh, I'm going back to that tenant. It needs to somehow track that that tenant is associated with this profile, get the GUID for that profile, and start executing as that. Okay. Likewise, if I come back here and, in my application, I kind of give a quick way to embed. And if I embed, let's go ahead and kind of take a look at that. What you can see here is that one call, was to basically figure out what reports are in that workspace. And once again, I couldn't call this as a service principal because it's not a member of that particular workspace. The profile is. Which profile? The one I've tracked right here. And then I need to create a embed token. We call generate token, and once again, we have the X Power BI profile, ID inside there. Okay, so, now that we have seen that, let's get back here, to the slides. And let's look a little bit more, into, how this works. And I think now that we just have a couple different questions here. Why don't I take these questions, at the end? I think we're going to have 5 or 10 minutes there. So I see a question from you, Josh, coming in. But let's kind of go through this last section there. Then I'll make sure that we, spend time on those. Okay, the last thing we're going to do is drill down a little bit more, into this application. So if you look at this application right here, you'll see that it's .NET 6. It is something, that has a basic controller. And I have a couple different pages inside here, but we have 2 things to point out. One is we have an entity framework database that's been created. And so if I kind of take a look at what we have here, we have this one particular class, that is going to, and I think instead of looking at that's the wrong class, I'm sorry, I mean to be looking at this. Okay. So basically, we're going to create a database. So a 30-second primer on entity framework. If you create a class and you inherit from DB context, the entity framework can generate a SQL database for you automatically. So what we're going to do is we're going to have these 2 tables. If you want to create a table, you create a DB set, and the record is defined by this type. So we're going to create 2 tables, profiles and tenants. Up here, you're going to see that for each app profile, we're going to create the profile name and the ID. That's as much as Power BI tracks. I'm going to track one extra property called exclusive. And the idea is if I create a workspace and I create a profile just for that workspace, I'm going to mark it as exclusive. So no one tries to pool. And also, if it's exclusive, when I delete the workspace, if it is based on an exclusive profile, we'll automatically delete that as well. Okay. Now, here's what we store for the customer tenant. If I go back and we kind of take, a look, inside of this database right here, let's kind of see, what this database looks like, as this starts up right here. Let me go just a couple more slides here. So app owns data multi-tenant. This application, just requires a single Azure AD application. And the idea is a single service principal can create as many profiles as it needs. Now, the application, the way it's built, it can scale upwards as far as you need to go. We have a design that's optimized, once again, because each profile will be a member of exactly one workspace, and we get complete isolation, of data set and data source credentials across our tenants. Now, the way things are going to work is that this application is going to call to the Power BI REST API to create a profile, to create a tenant. And when it does, it's going to write into our database. Every time we create a profile, we're going to track that. Every time we create a workspace, we're going to track that in our tenants table. So we have these two different tables down here. Once again, if I, go back here and we kind of drill down inside and take a look at our tables, what you can see here is that we've created two different profiles. And the idea is that profiles kind of get created automatically when I create a new tenant. Okay, I know it's kind of small here, but we keep the profile name, in the tenant, so that we can then kind of find the profile name as the primary key here, and we can kind of do lookups to find, those particular GUIDs. Okay, now what I did is I kind of went through kind of creating a tenant. Now, there could be, cases, where we just want to keep this one-to-one relationship, which is generally, what you should try to do in all cases. And the idea is that every time you create a tenant, behind the scenes, the application will create a profile and use that to create the tenant and whenever it needs to access that per tenant. Okay, and I can kind of look at those, but let's look at one other possibility here. Let's say that, in my application, I've decided that I want one profile to be the owner of multiple tenants. And, you shouldn't do this automatically, but let's say we had two different divisions of Acme Corp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a profile. So we'll create one, and we'll call this something like, Acme owner, just to give it a strange name. And so now that I've done that, let's go over to tenant. Okay, and let's say that, now what we'll do is we'll have, Acme USA. But down here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, show me the ones in the pool. And that's basically, every profile I have it marked with the exclusive tag. So now I can go ahead, and create one inside there. After, we create this one particular tenant. Okay, seems to be taking a second with this one. Power BI service can get old and slow, just like me. Okay, finally he's back. And now, let's create a second one. And then we have, Acme, Corp down under for my friends Phil Seamark. And I think Australians and Aussies like it when I spell down under correctly. And once again, we'll kind of point those, to the same tenant. Now, why would you do this? Because maybe you want to have something, where you set a database credential for a particular database and you want it, to be a single credential, across two different customer tenants, because you have the same person, who's in charge for setting those. But what you can see is generally, we like to keep, a one-to-one relationship, between the workspaces and the profiles. But it's also possible in your design, to kind of deviate, from that to some degree. Okay, so now we've kind of walked through, this particular application. Before we get to questions, starting with Joshua's, one other thing I wanted to show here, and that is I want to go back, and if I go to GitHub, and I say, open this thing up, as a Word document. So, if you want to get your hands dirty, and try out this application right here, there's a 30-page Word document, and the first part is just, trying to build your conceptual understanding, about 10 pages or so. but then after that, here's the step-by-step walkthrough, of going through, inside of Azure AD and Power BI and creating the app. And, so once again, step-by-step instructions, for anyone that wants to get to the point so you can test out this, application, just like I was demoing here today. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and move into our question session. And let's see. So, Joshua, I'm sorry you asked these a long time ago. I should have gotten to them earlier. So there are limitations related to SPM profiles. Does it not give us any extra security because the NDN can request a list of all profiles? I guess, there's this issue where you have one set of credentials to authenticate as a service principal. And that service principal can then, basically impersonate profile 1, 2, or 3. So to some degree, we're kind of saying whoever writes this code is a trusted, party, that is only going to, execute, on profile 1, when we have users, from that tenant inside there. And certainly if, you had someone who wrote code incorrectly or someone who's writing code maliciously, since you don't really have, authentication credential boundaries, between the tenant workspaces, I think it's fair to say that, that could be something to consider. The other thing is that when you use profiles, Power BI and its built-in authorization system understands exactly who profiles are. But when you're calling outside of Power BI, sometimes your service principal, is connecting to that Azure analysis services model. And I have 100 different profiles, but each time I connect, Azure AD and analysis services can't tell the difference. It's just one service profile. So that's one of the, the issues that we see inside there. Okay. Let's see if there are other questions right here. I think maybe we've gotten all the questions in, but certainly, ted.pattison@microsoft.com. If people have additional questions about this, send them my way. This is a brand new topic and we're, very excited about it. So hopefully everyone sees the big benefits here, especially those of you who, want to scale, to thousands of customer tenants, and 50, hundreds of thousands of users. And certainly we see a lot of customers, on that way, with some of the momentum they've built up, with their Power BI embedding projects. So with that, I thank everyone for attending today. And we look forward to next month where we'll have Phil Seamark from the Power BI CAT team with us to talk about the Power BI capacity and metrics app. So see you next month.
Thank you so much, Ted, for everything. I really, really appreciate all the knowledge that you're sharing with the community and all those. Thank you for tuning in this month. I just wanted to give a plug to our Power BI community at community.powerbi.com, where you can catch past DevCamp episodes, as well as our YouTube channel, where we have them up as well. Ted, thanks so much and have a good one.
Thank you, Dan.